Glad it's not rainy cold
Yes.
as it was before.
We watched you on the internet, though.
Oh, good. Thanks. All right, let's just do a reminder of where we've been again. So in the first session, we took a look at a very kind of surface look, a lot of information, broad sweep, where things have been in religion and society in the U.S. since World War II. We told the story that was a combination of things, a combination of forces. One combination was those things that were bringing people together. The U.S. was victors in a war. We were helping to rebuild Europe. We were helping to rebuild Japan. We had experienced depression and war, and now we were ready to get down to the business of business. And business was booming. Here and internationally for the U.S., we were on the top of things. We were also unified in our opposition to Soviet communism. And it's always great to have an external enemy, an identifiable external enemy. That's one of the biggest unifying forces in any social group, is an identified enemy. And that was a formidable one. Remember how James Bond had to keep morphing who the enemy was, and turning from Soviet Union to Middle Eastern terrorists and the like. So you kind of follow Bond through, and you'll get who the identifiable enemy is. We also, as religiously, we had formed a couple of affinity groups with the United Nations, which was new after World War II, failure of the League of Nations after World War I. Now we're going to do it right. United Nations, founded on a bunch of Christian principles about the dignity of every human being. And then we founded the World Council of Churches about the same time. I can't imagine trying to pull that body together today. Here in the United States, there were a small group of leaders of the mainline denominations who said we ought to form one church so that everybody understands the church on every corner is Christian church. COCU, Consultation on Church Union. And there still existed in kind of a sliver of what it once was, but it was a very hopeful plan amongst predominantly the white mainline denominations to form one church, even one parish, so that you might have a single congregation would have a location in the city, in the suburbs, and a rural area. Trying to, again, unify, because it was all these centripetal pulling in forces. Same time, however, there were a number of very strong centrifugal forces, those that were beginning to spin out. As in challenging that story of social unity, which especially white Christians were telling. Major civil rights actions taken in the middle and late 1950s. Because African Americans clearly were not mainstreamed in this country. In the 1960s, and you see how race, ethnicity, whether you were descendants of immigrants or settler colonists, or whether you're descendants of the original peoples who held these lands. Also then gender and sexuality. And then also, what does it mean to be an American? And does being a patriot mean America, love it or leave it? Or does being a patriot mean, well, sometimes you have to critique your country based on its ideals? So all of that was in play before the end of the 1960s. And all of those factors I just named are still in play today. The story I also told that I expanded in the second week was how we Methodists and United Methodists were part of what was called the mainline denominations. Those that were kind of culturally definitive of what Protestantism meant for a whole lot of the country, at least as we showed up in public life. And what we saw in starting in the late 1970s is a replacement of that Protestant main line with a much more conservative main line, with the evangelical main line. And in fact, morphing even further into that amalgamation of a kind of Republican politics and a kind of Christianity in what's become known as the Christian right or the religious right, as evidenced in such organizations as the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition and various family values organizations, or the guy in Colorado Springs, James Dobson, and Focus on the Family, and those sorts. So in the second week, I told a lot about how the religious right came into being, called really out of more private space into more public life. First, in opposition to the way that the IRS was handling some cases around desegregation of private schools that were intentionally set up to be whites-only schools, especially in Mississippi. And then how that energy of feeling the government had overstepped their bounds into their lives got some of them together, and as they continually looked for what issue would be one that would really galvanize a broader response that wasn't race, because it was no longer cool to make race the lead issue on things, and that's what I talked about, how the historians point to a particular phone call with a major funder of what became the religious right, Paul Weyrich, Jerry Falwell, Tim LaHaye of the Left Behind series and the like, and somebody in the phone call said, "What about abortion?" Which had just become legal 6 or 7 years before. And again, as I said the night I presented, Southern Baptists, when that legislation, when Roe v. Wade was first passed, the Southern Baptist Convention said this is a good piece of legislation. This honors individual conscience and the kind of relationship a woman would have with her doctor in deciding, and the government doesn't need to be part of this, and good legislation. But there were many more abortions in the subsequent years leading to the end of the 1970s than what even I think those who wanted Roe v. Wade to pass occurred. There was some backlash against it. Roman Catholic Church was always against it. Southern Baptists got against it. More conservative elements also got against it. And that became the issue that launches the moral majority. At the same time, and very importantly, and I think in all of these stories for us to understand, religiosity in the U.S. was changing pretty significantly. One piece of it that we saw accelerate a whole lot after the year 2000 was the number of persons who consider themselves unaffiliated. There was a canard for a while that, oh, well, you've let in all these immigrants from different countries that aren't Christian, and therefore you've diluted the Christian base in the country. Well, actually not. While the immigration patterns did change very significantly after 1965, a lot of the immigrants who came here were coming seeking asylum from religious persecution in their own countries because they were Christian minorities in those countries. So in fact, the majority of the immigrants who have come over from various countries are in fact from Christian background. The big change has not been that we have many more religions other than Christianity. The big change has been those who say, I don't have any religion. So the anti-religion, or the religion's just not important, or you go do your thing, I'm doing mine, I don't need what you have, sort of thing. To go along with the other major trend that is so important and has completely affected denominations like the United Methodists that used to boast we had basically basically a church for every county in the United States. And in some places like Ohio, we actually had a church in every county in Ohio, and we're very much the dominant Protestant religious group. The shrinking of the number of middle-sized congregations, and the fact that the middle-sized congregation, the one that I probably prepared for in seminary, 250 members, full-time pastor, one or two part-time staff people, full-time assistant in the office, that church hardly exists anymore. Churches have become smaller and larger. I showed you, just to recall, I showed you the chart that showed in the early 1960s, there were very few churches that claimed to worship 2,000 or more people per Sunday. Very, very few churches in the United States. By the end of the counting time, probably in 2014, 2015 or thereabouts, there were over 1,600 such churches that worshipped over 2,000 per Sunday. And the vast majority of Christians now in the United States worship in congregations that have at least 400 in worship, whereas the vast majority of congregations in the United States have less than 70 in worship. Churches have gotten smaller, churches have gotten larger. Almost all, not quite all, but it was well upwards of 90% of those churches worshiping 2,000 and more per Sunday identify as evangelical conservative churches. So that's the kind of story about religion that I told. And then last week, it took a couple weeks ago now, but in the last session, I was looking at that overall narrative about what the United States is, to which Christians over time have contributed. Starting with the city set on a hill, the new Israel, and the Promised Land, which I tried to say as best I could. There are others who are saying this and have said it better. These narratives only fit a certain segment of our population and always have only fit a certain segment of the population. Because for African Americans who were brought here, Africans who were brought here against their will, this was Egypt, a place of captivity. And oftentimes when they sung spirituals about the Jordan River, what they meant is the Ohio. Spirituals were code for oftentimes developed as a kind of means of resistance to the white slave master religion type of version of Christianity. For Native Americans, of course, this was their land. We white folks thought this known as the land of promise, so it kind of made them the Canaanites, those who were conquered and displaced. So what I was trying to indicate is that narrative, which I was trying to summarize in that phrase, manifest destiny, that there is a certain population that had a God-given right to move across these lands and to inhabit them, and then to export what we're doing around the world as part of the destiny of America. That this narrative, I think, locates both Christianity and the U.S. in the wrong place in the biblical narrative. If you want to use the biblical narrative as an indicator of where we might be, I think a better place for the current time that we're in is to say, well, we're in the wilderness. The Exodus, you can say the Exodus has happened, but this is an interesting Exodus. The bondage we're trying to get out of is the system of oppressions, as well as the system of benefits that didn't actually apply to all the people. And so in this Exodus, as we're out here in the wilderness, it's a very interesting time, because both those who set up the systems to benefit themselves and those who were at the disadvantaged part of the system, we're all out there in the wilderness together. Because you're trying to deal with that situation of we're not all seeing America from the same place. And I think one of the difficulties in finding common ground right now is we have no common story that makes sense to us. We can't keep telling lies. I'm seeing Michelle Place over here, and I know where the Tulsa Historical Society has been in trying to surface and keep in front of us as one of the various organizations that have, and along with John Hope Franklin Center and the Race Massacre Commission and the like, that, I mean, for how many of you grew up in Oklahoma did you know about the 1921 race massacre here? I mean, I hear it constantly from people who said, I was not told about that. I'm certain in growing up in Illinois, I did not hear, or if we read anything about it, a Trail of Tears and Tahlequah and Tulsa and places like that. It was in passing, rather than, no, this is American history. This is as much American history as Washington crossing the Delaware. Probably a little more important than that in some ways. So how do you find a narrative that is honest, that neither discounts the ideals and the values that continue to drive and influence, myself included, so many of us, and that we're so proud of, if we could just actually live out those values in a way that all people actually benefited from them. So that's why I was trying to indicate, well, what if we tried wilderness? And because in the wilderness, it's that place of unlearning what it meant to be people living with oppression, learning how to be free, learning how to be free together. Very anxious time, which ours is. A troubling time, which ours is. A time where we're always hearing, whatever work the kind of from one of our hymns, time makes ancient truths uncouth. And that's kind of where we're at right now. How can we as Christians contribute to that narrative? Is where at least that's where my energies are, and one of the reasons we're pulling principles together. Pardon me?
The hymn you speak.
I know, right.
Was taken out of the hymn.
Right. It was
Once to every man.
once for every, exactly. That was it. That was it.
What is it like now?
I don't know. So that kind of brings us then to our own denomination. I mean, so we started, this kind of sense from the 40s and 50s about things seem to be unified in American culture, but that was sort of a patina or veneer. Underneath, things were roiling. We're roiling more in the open now. I think both as a culture and in our faith groups. So that brings us to us, United Methodists. Whatever else happens after our general conference, I believe that our history as trying to be a Big Tent denomination is over. We have been, maybe almost uniquely, other than Roman Catholics, America's Big Tent denomination. I still remember how astounded I was reading Francis Asbury's journal. It says, "We are here to civilize, spiritualize, and Methodize the continent." Our first bishop, and he was good at it. All three of those things. He thought we were going to. He really thought that, and Asbury was perfectly of his time in seeing how all of history kind of led to this Methodist moment. And he even tells it this way. It says, so it was Jesus and the apostles, and then after the apostles died, and the Roman Catholic Church kind of takes over, and so they went through this kind of Dark Ages period. It says, and then comes the Reformation, and things start getting better. And Luther got some things right, and then the Anglican Church came along, and they got some things right, and then John Wesley came along, and he got it even more right. And then Methodism was brought over to these shores where we don't have all of the superstitions of Europe, and we don't have all of the bishops claiming territories, and we don't have all of the all the trappings of a couple thousand years of religion. And here we can reform a repristinated primitive church. And it's all led to this moment. And Methodists are right here for it. That was his attitude. There was a lot of Methodist attitude throughout the 19th century. But I have to remind everybody, I think, as we go into talking tonight about civil discourse, we've never been very good at that. We are not a peace church. We, in fact, haven't been a very peaceful church a lot of our history. And I mean, let's think about this for a moment. So, just a few years after Methodism gets started here in this country, as a separate church, which of course it wasn't during John Wesley's lifetime in England. He wanted to keep Anglican, but could see towards the end of his life, probably not going to work. Comes over here to the United States, when Asbury and Coke are setting up the church here with their care package that Wesley sent over for how to do this church. Wesley, who was a divine right of kings guy, well after people in England actually believed in the divine right of kings, Wesley did. And Wesley had written about how the Americans ought not to revolt against your king. It actually got some Methodists tarred and feathered, which is no laughing matter. It can kill a person. Here in these colonies, most either went to Canada. The preachers either went to Canada or, like Asbury, hid out in barns in Maryland during the war. So Wesley afterwards, when he writes his care package, his letter to the new church going to be founded in America, his phrase about the church is that this church that this country that, quote, God has so strangely set free. And that was his attitude. But just a few years after we start here, we have our first split. The Republican Methodists. As people who said, why is there more freedom in the Republic than there is in the church, pushing against what they considered to be the monarchical power of a bishop, especially since there was only one bishop at the time, Asbury, as there was for several decades, just Mr. Asbury, and of course he made himself a bishop. So I won't go into the joke about that one. So just there. Before the 1700s, turning to the 1800s, we have splits, and then right into the 1800s, we have splits over race. Because in the church couldn't see persons of African descent ever itinerating, which was a key part of. Itineration is about as important in Methodism as the divinity of Jesus is. Since they couldn't itinerate and serve white congregations, Asbury would only allow them to be deacons. And the white leaders wanted to appoint every preacher in every pulpit. And the black leaders were saying, well, in the Baptist churches, they get to do their own. So we split over race. In the 1820s, we split again. The Methodist Protestants come out of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Hear the difference, Episcopal, Protestant? We're bishop-led, we are more people-led. They come out over issues of not wanting bishops and a lady having more say. 1843, the Wesleyan Methodists withdraw because they said Methodist Church has become a slave-holding denomination, and the Wesleyan Methodists were abolitionists. Very importantly, when 1843, when the Wesleyans withdraw, that leaves an 1844 General Conference a very different dynamic, and I want to keep this in mind in the coming months for us. Because the dynamic was the radical, if you want to do right and left here, the radical left were the Wesleyans, led by the New England Conference. They're very proud of this still, who said abolition is the only way to go. Far on the right were those who, along with some of their Presbyterian colleagues, were writing treatises on why black people always ought to be enslaved. And here's the Christian Bible that tells you so. And in the middle were those who, some who said this shouldn't be a political issue, this is a personal issue. Some who said, let's go ahead and, I really think that if they're free Africans and then allow them to repatriate to Africa, even though by that point, of course, many people had never known any country other than this one. So think dreamers in some ways. But it was a repatriation, because they couldn't quite see how blacks and whites would actually live together. That was the moderates. So the Wesleyans were drawn in 1843. What does that do to the spectrum that's left here? Now the center is not the center anymore. So they got to make decisions about whether to move right or move left. Keep that in mind with whatever happens, is whether Judicial Council strikes down that traditional plan, and we start our start our splitting, which I think we'll do. It won't necessarily turn out the way we think it's going to, because it's not, the first split is not going to be the last split. We split really badly in 1844. They were so mad about it in the North that they basically fired all the delegates that they thought had given away the church in 1844 and reneged on most of the agreement by the time, and then started fighting the South over what today is Cokesbury, over the book concern, saying the South, it says you don't even get any of the profits from the book concern. That's actually a case wound up going to the Supreme Court in the United States to decide in the South's favor, by the way. So we fight a civil war. Lincoln said more Methodists fought on both sides than any other denomination, of course, which is true. And get that, we fought on both sides. We have always been the church that fights on at least two sides. And we split. And then in 1865, when we decided, can we come back together or not, and the South said, hell no. Not after the way we were treated. You called us apostates. You prostituted the pulpit with your politics there in the North. Says, no way, this isn't happening. So there were efforts along the way. We had, up until 1939, we had a couple of hymnals that we did together and the like, is trying to at least sing our way into communion. Do want to, some of you will know this, but probably very few. Northwestern, as in Northwestern University, current mascot is the Wildcats, right? That wasn't the mascot up until the 1950s. Then it was the Fighting Methodists. It was Methodist school. It was Fighting Methodists. So we are fighters. We have been fighters throughout a great part of our history. And when we're not fighting, we're often burying a fight. This is a different way to tell it. 1939, the Methodist Protestants, that group that withdrew in the 1820s, so it was 1828, I think, they're the ones who actually brokered the deal to get the North and the South back together. But at the cost of creating the central jurisdiction. Because this was Jim Crow time still. And there was still this agreement going on between white Christians on both sides of the old Mason-Dixon line about African Americans and their place. And in 1939, when the church came back together and became the Methodist Church again, the Methodist Protestants, Methodist Church North, Methodist Church South, it was by creating a non-geographical jurisdiction in which all African Americans would serve. Have a black bishop or black bishops there, because they, again, could not see a place where African Americans could itinerate, which included not only pastors, but also bishops. And according to the report from that Uniting Assembly, by the way, when the white people rose to cheer, black people kept in their seats. That's what we did. That's how we came back together in 1939. We buried that for a while. The last vestiges of central jurisdiction did not go away until the early 1970s, a few years after the uniting of the church with the Evangelical United Brethren and Methodists in 1968. And then in 1972, we started fighting about homosexuality. So you have to, when you have that kind of sweep, what that is a reminder of me is the form the church has now, we've had since 1968. And yeah, that's a lot of my life, but the form the church had for the first nearly century and a half of our existence was mostly, how many different ways can we split this thing? So, history's forces come and flow, and sometimes they pull together, and sometimes they pull apart. And at least the story as I understand it is, we have participated in whatever the forces are, the centrifugal forces that have been spinning out especially since the 1960s. Every position you can think of on civil rights, for all persons, on the political right, on the political left, political center, you'll find United Methodists there. Every single one. That's been part of being the big tent, and it's great. It is really a great thing when locally we can still have some big tent congregations, and I know we do. And my suspicion is Boston Avenue continues to be one of those kind of congregations. But it's tougher, it's tougher to pull off now. And I think it's partly tougher because of where the culture has gone to, which, as we know, is so polarized, and it's polarized more on the national level probably than it is on the local level. I don't have these. I could have made a couple of slides probably to show you. It's really interesting when you break down the American electorate further than what you normally see. Right? Basically, are you right or are you left? Are you red or are you blue? And that kind of thing. And you break it down a little further. What you find is those who are actually on the left or the right, as in activists on the left or the right, are under 10% each.
Even in Oklahoma?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen it broken down by state. But this would be activists. This would be people who are actively working on an agenda in public life from one of those two perspectives. The middle is actually quite large still, but the middle isn't activated all the time. One of the very unfortunate, I think, to our detriment, facts in our life is how few of us are kind of pay attention to things political and social until it impacts us really negatively. And then you get activated. So what we're seeing now is that the polarization is really being driven, if you will, by those who are most strongly activist and those channels of communication that are used. And I don't need to go into that. You can find any position you want somewhere out there, and so different than in the world 20 years ago even. You can find them anywhere in the world and start banding together to do something. And that can be a great thing, and it can also be a really detrimental thing. Tonight, let's throw Puff the Magic Dragon. So You remember how this goes, right? Puff the magic dragon is by the sea, and frolics in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. And then little Jackie Paper. Yeah, okay. Right. So when Peter, Paul, and Mary sang that, you know, they thought they were singing a song about a little boy growing up, loss of innocence and the like. But there was a big controversy at the time as to whether or not this was all drug-related song. So, Puff the Magic Dragon. Puff. Magic Dragon. Live by the sea. Sea stands for cocaine. And frolicked in the autumn mist. Well, that's when pot smokers like to toke up. Making a mist in a land called Honolulu. Little Jackie Paper, as in roll your own. That's the way the whole thing went. And they spent years trying to say that's not what it's about. Well, I once there's a great little album that Noel Paul Stuckey does. It was the Paul of Peter, Paul, and Mary, where he tells this story. And he said, but you know, says the more I got into kind of listening to what they were talking about, I thought maybe there was something in it. Maybe it was something we hadn't seen before, and we were sending messages. And so then I started seeing messages everywhere, like, oh, see, can you see? C stands for cocaine. In the dawn's early light, oh yeah, that's when they toke up too. But so proudly we inhaled. How difficult it is to put out any message that is actually received in the same way, in the way it's being put out. And it's also a wonderful example of, if you want to twist somebody's words to make them say something that they didn't actually say, oh, you have plenty of opportunities to do it. So, let's talk a little about Christian civil discourse. And I think, what do we call this as a topic? Is it civil discourse? Should I say Christian civil discourse? Should we call them crucial conversations, Christian mindful discourse, which I tend to like, or Christ-minded discourse, as in what Paul says in Philippians, have this mind amongst yourselves, or in Romans chapter 12, that David preached on just a couple of Sundays ago, I think it was, about having your mind formed according to the way of Christ, so that you might know what is the good and perfect and acceptable will of God. Seems to me there are three, when we're talking about civil discourse, first I want you to take away, we're not talking about being nice. This is not Minnesota nice or Wisconsin nice or whatever, if Oklahoma has a version of Oklahoma nice or Canadian. This is not nice, as in avoiding the difficult stuff. Let's just be nice. Let's not get into anything controversial. Not at all. That's not what civil discourse is. The three basic options that humankind has to deal with intense conflict are violence. I don't like what you're doing, I'm going to stop you from doing it. Separation. All right, can't stand you. We're going to our separate corners or separate continents or separate houses or separate rooms or whatever it is, and using our words. There really aren't any other significant choices when you're dealing with intense conflict. So let's talk about some tonight, how we use our words. Fundamental question. Civil discourse, as I'm going to show in a moment, is a particular form of social interaction. And it is effective only, I think, within certain channels and certain circumstances. It's just being civil with each other, I shouldn't say just, because civil is really hard, as I'm going to describe, is very different if you're talking about divorce or marriage. I don't know if anybody's ever been in marriage counseling before. I have. and I'm twice married. And in my first marriage, when I finally encouraged my wife to go for counseling with me, I remember the counselor's first comment is, are we doing divorce counseling or marriage counseling? It's a very different thing. Are we talking about, are we here to talk about our plan of separation? Which when we talk about general conference, I mean, I think that was one of the surprises to some of us, is how quickly the issues that's related to how we're going to divide the money came up. You know, top on the list, which I'm all for. That's important issues, but that's not the issue you start with if you want to stay together, right? So that was a good, kind of a good indicator that this is moving towards some sort of non-reconciled outcome here. Being civil can work on either marriage or divorce counseling, but you've got two different goals. Marriage counseling, you want to see, is this relationship salvageable, or I'd like to see it keep going. And divorce counseling is, how do we part amicably? Or, depending on who you are, it might be, how do I depart with everything I want? Okay, everybody who engages, I know, everybody whose job it is to engage in these kinds of conversations we'll be talking about, they all say the same thing. About the toughest work to do is to stay in the room. Stay in the room and stay at the table. Because there's so many opportunities to say, I don't need this. You know, I got conflict at home, I don't need it at church. I got conflict at work, I don't need it here. I got conflict, you know, it's so tough to stay in it because it takes energy, it takes some vulnerability, because everybody sitting at a table armed, it's a really bad thing. I mean, I can't imagine, let's get into myself into some trouble here. I can't imagine an open carry civil conversation. Figuratively speaking, you gotta leave your weapons at the door. Also, it's pretty easy, unfortunately, and especially in kind of where we're at today, as a culture. I'm not saying as a church now, as a culture. It's really hard to stay civil if somebody at the table is not respecting the humanity of the others at the table, or when you're trying to even negotiate a separation. And there's a quote that's, find this all over the internet. It's not actually a James Baldwin quote. It's somebody, it's a blogger who calls himself Son of Baldwin, it's Robert Jones. And I think it's a great chew on this a long time line. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. Yeah, from the time I heard this, which a faculty member quoted it to me at one point in a heated discussion, it's a good line. It's a good one to hang on. I'm trying to hang on to that and in the rest of what I'm saying this evening, as well as in the way I go about these conversations. I also want to point out, civil discourse is but one tool, and this is again what's the right venue for this, for change in conflict management. I'm sorry, this is all, it turns out to be small. All these are tools for change in conflict management, as in legislative voting. We vote to change. We might lobby for change or manage conflict. We might engage in a court action and hope the court can settle things. We can engage in boycotting in order to make some change. A different kind of communication or discourse is comedy and satire. I honestly don't know what kind of late night show Stephen Colbert would have if it weren't for Donald Trump. I mean, he does that meanwhile segment too, but I mean, he's not the only one who's like making a career. Now, it gets me through the day. but is making a career comedy and satire. That's not, he's not trying to be civil in the way we're going to be talking about it. That's not his goal. There's also the Jeremiah. Everybody know that what a Jeremiah is? I mean, it comes from the word Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's discourse is in railing against the religious and political leaders of his own day in the path of disaster that they led Israel down. The Jeremiad is a well-known, in American religious history, sermonic form of basically woe is us because of, and then the following ways in which the country has departed from its true values and somehow has sinned and oppressed. And two Jeremiads that you'll probably recall, both came right after 9/11. One was when Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell both said, 9/11 happened because America kicked God out of the schools because you have secular courts and you allow gay people. This is not an exact quote, but those are things they actually said. And then there was Jeremiah Wright, who was for a while Barack Obama's pastor at Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, who got in a huge trouble, actually much more so than the other guys did, when he said, yeah, based on our policies in the Middle East, America, the chickens have come home to roost. That's kind of Jeremiah. That's the, thus saith the Lord, you've messed up kind of stuff. That's a form of discourse. It's not, again, trying to be civil. There's also civil disobedience, the acts of protest that are peaceful, peaceful demonstrations like. There's violent protest against property. Some people draw the line there, some protesters. Violent protest against persons. Some would draw the line there. There's voluntary withdrawal or excommunication and expulsion. These again are all means, these are all ways that human beings have for making change or conflict management that we've done. At times there have been peoples that have tried extermination of some other. Containment, whether that be camps or walls or reservations, and revolution. Those are all different ways to go about change. Different as they are from civil discourse. So here's my working definition. When I'm talking about civil discourse, this is what I think we're talking about. Christian civil discourse is a practice of conversation and arguments to be used when parties deeply disagree. Start there. It's when we deeply disagree. We don't, when we're agreeing with each other, nobody's asking to be civil. Nobody says, oh please, we got so much agreement going on, let's be more civil. Second, to practice Christian civil discourse means to learn to listen for and speak truth in love. I think that's in Ephesians. Be open to correction and to what God may be saying to you through the one with whom you disagree. I'm going to come back to that. And aim toward finding or creating a way to live well together or part without enmity. Learn to listen for and speak truth in love. Be open to correction of what God may be saying to you through the one with whom you disagree. That's one of my ways of thinking about how to stay at the table. There might actually be something here I need to hear. And aim towards finding or creating a way to live well together apart without enmity. If you can't achieve agreement and find common ground, can you achieve understanding of your disagreement? Sometimes we say that the goal is we want to find common ground. Sometimes that's I gotta say that's too ambitious a goal. Maybe though, to redefine what common ground means is can we come to an understanding, at least as to what the disagreement actually is. Some of you in the Sunday school classes I've taught will have heard me talk about Krista Tippett's Civil Conversations Project. They have she did an interview with two men who were on opposing sides of the same-sex marriage question for a long time. David Blankenhorn and Jonathan Rauch. Blankenhorn was like, no, what I'm in this for is there's too little fathering going on in the U.S. and so I'd like to see fathers step up more. And Rauch was a same-sex marriage advocate. And they debated for a long time publicly. And then they found that, well, actually, we have common ground. As in, long-term relationships are hard. Period. Whoever's in a long-term relationship knows they're hard. How do we support adults in long-term relationships? So that was kind of their common ground. But one of the pieces they came to is they said sometimes we think our discussions and debates with each other are not so much about finding agreement as achieving disagreement. And by achieving disagreement, what they mean is, do you actually understand what it is you're disagreeing about? Have you listened intently enough so that in the back and forth with each other, each party can say, yes, you've understood me. And we do differ. We're not in the same place. But we found at least where we achieve, where we are genuinely in disagreement. That's it's clarity, but it's hard work getting there. For me, then, there's a couple of slides here, I'm going to go through fairly quickly. And if anybody wants these, by the way, just either email me or if you want to, don't bother the office with it. But I'm happy to send these to you. I've got several references, especially at the end, that are websites that I'm also going to recommend that you get to know. These are some principles, I think, that derive from our faith that I'd love to see more of amongst us Christians. Each person is created in the image of God. Every person's and every group's perspective is limited and distorted by finitude and sin. One of the 10 Commandments is, do not bear false witness against your neighbor. When we misrepresent what someone else says, we bear false witness. Really wonder how much false witness bearing there goes on every night on the TV. News, so-called. Within the church, we're joined to Christ in baptism and at the table. And where do you find that? Well, all of Paul's writing. All of it. En Christo, and to be in Christ. It's completely through everything he says. In 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12, develop Paul's understanding of the church as the body of Christ. And how to find agreement, or at least how to live together in that body. Here's one of my favorites. William Adams Brown, there were a number of theologians in the opening part of the 20th century who reflected on the kind of spirituality of democracy, which I think is worth reflecting on again, since it's one of those things that I think maybe we say we value more than you can actually see happening right now. He said, he wrote, one of the religious bases for democracy is that God may have said something differently to you than God said to me. Therefore, we need to listen to each other. How different from I have a revelation, and I now have it all clear. And so what happens when I have a revelation and I have it all clear? Well, you either accept that, or you reject that, or you accept it in part or whatever, but it doesn't give you a whole lot of voice at that point. It just gives you a set. What Brown is saying is, no, actually, it really may be the case that God spoke to you, and 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 God spoke to you. And until you have a conversation with each other, you have no clue what the fullness is of what God might have said. What an interesting idea to bring either to church or to the civic realm. Last time I looked anyways, humility and self-criticism are virtues in the Christian life. 1 Corinthians 13, if I speak without love, I'm just making noise. Ephesians 4 speaks both to speaking the truth in love, and that it's okay to be angry, but don't let the sun go down on your anger. Being angry and then being consumed by one's anger are two very different things. I've always liked Albert Outler, taught for years at Perkins School of Theology, wrote that community precedes doctrine. Now embrace that for a moment. It's not the doctrine that creates the community. The community actually precedes and creates the doctrine. That's certainly true scripturally. I mean, one of the things that we Protestants sometimes overlook is that it's not the biblical texts which are our connection to Jesus of Nazareth. It's the community of Christians that produce those texts and have carried those texts forward. The community actually is the Christian community in some way is our continuous connection to Jesus of Nazareth. Same way, community precedes doctrines. Which kind of, for me then, the correlate or an affinity is, was the Sabbath made for humanity, or was humanity made for the Sabbath? Community and doctrine, very interesting. When you get into discussions, especially when you get into discussions about what's the right way to think, believe, practice. How does this play out? I think that's again an interesting conversation. And in terms of conversation, my favorite rules for conversation come from the theologian Bernard Lonergan, who wrote, "Be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible, if necessary, change." All right. I don't know where in society these days civil discourse is actually being taught. I see, as I've looked around, I see a law school here and there that's trying to teach more of it. And I'm going to show you some links at the end about some organizations working on this. But as far as having the kind of civil conversations I'm talking about, the kind of difficult, conversations that are tough about really difficult, sticky matters. You're sticking at the table and really trying to understand and communicate and find out where we agree and disagree, and then seeing what happens out of that. I don't see too many places that's being taught. There are very few training programs, so how do we, so going to my end here, how can this congregation or any congregation become a place where people are trained in how to speak with one another with Christian civility when the going gets tough? That's a training. That goes in the middle. Learning to converse civilly is like therapy after an injury or an extended illness. It's serious and difficult, or breaking an ingrained habit because we have to do something differently. It's like if you had a leg injury and you learn to walk with a limp. And you could learn to walk differently, but it's going to take a lot of painful work in order to do that. Your body still wants to be off kilter, and you got to train it for that to be different. How many have ever made a New Year's resolution that you broke about day 2? Yeah, right. Why? Because habits are so doggone hard to break. They take a lot of attention to break them. They often take some support group, others who know, hold you accountable and the like. Well, if we're all concerned about the polarization of our discourse and the way that polarization has even affected our religious and our congregational lives, our denominational lives, We're not going to learn differently just by, to be Wesley again. Today, I got brought to perfection. Now I am, yesterday I was not, but today I've been perfected in love. No, that's not us. That's not the way, if there are people who have that kind of revelation and conversion experience, excellent, great. Most of the rest of us is slog. It's unlearning, it's that wilderness experience again. It's the unlearning the way we've been doing things in order to learn something different, which is always going to be difficult work. Brene Brown is an author that I happen to like a lot, and I haven't read her new book on leadership, but this one, Braving the Wilderness, her last one, she talks about having a strong back, soft front, and a wild heart. And the strong back, she says, back is the courage muscle. You have the courage to stick with it, to stay in whatever the conversation is. The front is the vulnerability muscle. In order to have success in a difficult conversation, you've got to be vulnerable. And she said, of course, what often happens is, especially in a polarized situation, is you have strong front and weak back. So that you're armored in the front, no vulnerability here, can't show any vulnerability. If I show any vulnerability in this interview on TV, I'm going to be there's going to be a new internet meme on me going around that's going to kill me for the next, year, 2 years, the rest of my life and the like. And so you don't always exercise your courage when you're well armored in the front. So she raises the question for all of us in any kind of leadership position. I know that includes a number of you in this room. So how do leaders create spaces for people to strengthen both the courage and the vulnerability muscles? This is the thing I think, again, that I'd love to see more of us in religious congregations doing more intentionally. I think there's a huge role for us these days. Again, not whatever's going on in the national church, it's going to happen. Forces are in play, which includes the Holy Spirit, it includes history, it includes animosity, it includes hope. How that makes it come out, I don't know. How it can come out here, I think you got more control over that. You got more say in that. How do you exercise both your courage and your vulnerability muscles well here? Are there ways that maybe we could be doing more of that? I love this little image here. How much change happens out of that? You're put in that position. What's your motivation to be different? Well, maybe fear. Maybe so you don't feel ashamed and self-loathing at that point. But it's not going to be because this was effective. It's more about the active listening and everything you know about. You've heard many times self-awareness and paraphrasing and observing body language and just being attentive to the people you're with. I'm going to give you an opportunity now. Actually, let me, for the sake of we're still on Facebook, yes? For the sake of that, let me just go to the end here for a moment, and then I'm going to come back to this, because I got some discussion stuff I want you all to do with each other for a few minutes. But I'm just going to put this up here. Some resources. There are people who've done this a much longer time than I have, and have developed some wonderful resources. Parker Palmer, author, I think a lot of you probably know. His Center for Courage and Renewal, operating out of Madison, Wisconsin, which is a lot about how communities, either religious communities or civic groups and the like, can have better conversations with each other. If you don't know his book, Healing the Heart of Democracy, it's one I highly recommend. There's a civility center at the University of Arizona where they've got a national civility project going, and they've got some lawmakers, both at a local level and national level, which sign on in pledges to be civil with each other. There's Krista Tivit's Civil Conversations Project, huge number of wonderful resources there, lots of videos to watch, podcasts to listen to, great inspirational things. Greg Ellison is a professor at Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, professor of pure pastoral psychology, has written a very fine book called Fearless Dialogues, which also describes a process that he's got a training center that he works with, doing training around the country, but particularly based in the Atlanta area, where he says, he uses a phrase from his grandmother, what he learned on his grandmother's porch. Can't change the world, but I can change or at least influence people within 3 feet of me. And he's done an amazing set of conversations with people who would never be in the same room together, creating some really wonderful moments and teaching people a lot about being human and dignified together. There are 2 TED Talks that I highly recommend on this topic too. One is called Is Civility a Sham? Teresa Bejan's, which she has a book out on this too. If you don't like I won't say the words out loud, but if you don't like hear the word BS spelled out, don't listen to her talk. She uses it a couple of times by saying, like a lot of folks I've heard in my circles, she said, well, when I first started studying civil discourse, I thought, this is just BS. I said, because this is just a way of basically, somebody throws a punch, you try to retaliate, and the other person says, no, wait a minute, you be civil. And that civility is simply a way of, being nasty in most places, but then when you're with somebody that's been offended, is telling them, but you now have to shut up. Be civil. And she said, actually, when I started studying it and found out what civility is all about, she said, it's actually about the only way, using your words, you can have deep disagreements and still stay together as a society. So she had a conversion experience by studying civility as it came to religious and political civility in the 18th century, basically. Julia Galef's talk here on why you think you're right even when you're wrong. Fascinating talk, absolutely fascinating talk. And she talks about the difference between basically a set mindset and what she calls a scout mindset. And the set mindset is, the illustration she gives of that is the Dreyfus affair. Very famous case out of French history, latter part of the 19th century, a French officer being accused of espionage, of being the agent of a foreign government. And he was convicted, put in prison, Devil's Island, I think. So no little prison. And it says, but there was a officer that was an anti-Semite. Did I say Dreyfus was Jewish? Yeah, Dreyfus was Jewish. There's an officer who was an anti-Semite who said, there's something not quite right about all of this. And he actually investigated until he found that Dreyfus was actually completely innocent of the charges. Well, to have convicted Dreyfus, everything Dreyfus had done was twisted in another way. So that, for instance, Dreyfus was an expert in several languages. And rather than, well, what a great thing to be an expert in several languages, his accusers said, yeah, that's what spies do. They know several languages in order to be able to communicate with their foreign persons they're colluding with. So it was all twisted that direction. And it was all, and there was a group of well-meaning people who were completely unconscious about their own anti-Semitic biases that played into accusing Dreyfus of espionage and sending him to Devil's Island. But it was getting curious. Rather than going around with that kind of herd mindset, it was getting curious and digging down underneath is what she's trying to encourage us. How do you think more like Scout? Is going on ahead, and it's more everything you're involved in. It's a process of discovery rather than I already know everything that I need to know here. So 2 really excellent TED Talks. So why don't you go ahead and say goodbye to Facebook, because we're going to